choking my mother. And she says that he ran up a bar tab for like $700 or $800 after my mother had already paid for the party. And when the owner gave my mother the bar tab, my mother said, "What is this for?" And he said, "Your son-in-law was buying everybody drinks and he told me to give you the check." So when my mother got home, he confronted her and he attacked my mother, and my wife had to jump on him. She scratched his face and a whole big scene, and then he ran out of the house. So I was, like I said, I was in treatment. So when I got out of treatment, I went right to see my father's partner, Tony Lee, who was a made member of the Gambino family. He was my father's partner because my father was in prison. And I went to see him and I told him, you know, this Frankie beat my mother up. And he says to me, "I know." Just like that. He went, "I know." I said, "What do you mean you know?" I said, what do you mean you know? What are we going to do here? And he said, "We're going to kill him." And, you know, and that was fine because that's the life that we lived. And I said, "All right, you know, so what are we going to do?" He said, "Well, you're going to have to go to visit your father and get permission from your father. He has to okay it because we're going to put it on record because, you know, Dominic's going to do it." He wanted Dominic to get credit for it because Dominic was proposed and I was proposed. It's funny how in the mob there's protocols to commit a murder. I mean, because it's a sanctioned thing, it's work, it's part of what you do. So you have to get permission, you have to put it on record, it has to go to the boss, and the boss eventually has to okay it, because if they don't okay it and you do it anyway, then you know your life on the line, because you know homicides bring heat and it's a whole big procedure. So the first step was I had to go visit my father. So I went to visit my father and I told him what happened. And he says to me, "What does he think, I'm dead?" So I said, "No, he don't care. You know, he's a bad kid. He just don't care. You know, I don't know what he thinks." So I told my father what the plan was and he said, "Do it." And he okayed it. So I went back to New York and I told Tony Lee my father okayed it. And at that point, Tony Lee sent for John Gotti, who was a captain at the time of the Gambino family. And we told Jeannie what happened. And Jeannie said, "Okay, I'll go tell my brother." And he went to John, who was the boss, John Gotti. And the next day or a day later, Jeannie came back and he told us his brother okayed it. And his brother, you know, was very close with it. John was very close to us. You know, we have a different relationship with him. We knew him when he was a kid. He really loved my mother and he loved my father, of course. And so he okayed it. And then we put a plan together. And you want me to explain the plan?
Yeah, on this channel, we like to get as much detail as possible. Some of our guests, they say, "I'm going to cut a long story short." And I'm like, "No, make it long.
Yeah, so you know, like I said, he was a dangerous kid. It couldn't have been like we couldn't have just rolled up on him on a street corner and gun him down in the street like you see on TV. You know, he was a dangerous kid. He really had to be done. We had to really reel him in and make him feel comfortable because, you know, he was a killer. You know, he was dangerous. I mean, and so we put a plan in place where he was a thief. We knew he was an armored truck robber. Like I said, he was an armed robber. That was basically his thing. He was a thief. So we planned. We told him that Tony Lee knew of a safe house of drug money in South Ozone Park. We don't know how much money was in there, but we know that it's where the drug dealers keep their money. So we told him that, and then we told him Tony Lee wanted to explain it to him, and then we sent for this guy Tommy who had a boat, and after the murder they were going to take his body out on a boat and dispose of him in the Atlantic Ocean. So what happened was we told him about this score, that we had a safe house that had money, and Tony Lee wanted to speak to him. So I called him up the day before and I said, "Listen, Tony Lee wants to meet you tomorrow morning at Cafe Liberty. He wants to tell you what's going on with that situation I told you about." He says, "All right." So that morning I picked him up. You know, it's funny, you know, when I talk about it, because actually it didn't even faze me back then, you know, like I picked him up and he came out of the house and he had shorts on and a t-shirt, and he got in my car, you know, we laughed, he kissed me on the cheek, hello, and, you know, and I'm sitting there with him and I'm driving this guy to his death, like, you know, like it was like the sun was out, it was a hot June day out. You know, he had shorts on and a t-shirt. And I drove him to Cafe Liberty. And when I pulled up, Tony Lee's brother, who was another soldier in the Gambino family, Mikey Gal, he was sitting outside waiting for us. And we got out of the car and I walked across the street and Mikey got up off the chair and he came over and he hugged Frankie and he kissed him. Hello, I'm happy to see you. Another guy knew he was going to die. And, you know, I wasn't nervous up to that point. I was pretty calm up to that point because my part in it was really important because I had to bring him there. So I had to stay like really calm and I couldn't like let my hand be known because if he had any kind of inkling, you know, like anything could have happened. So my job getting him there was to keep him calm and, you know, keep him, you know, so I got him there and I didn't feel anything until I walked in the door and he was in front of me and he walked in and Mikey was on the outside and the door locked from the outside and the door closed and I heard Mikey lock the door. He didn't hear the door lock, but I did. And when I heard the door lock, I got a little nervous at that point. You know, I got a little nervous. And when I walked in, there was 3 people at the bar. There was a counter. It was this guy, Freddie, who later on became a soldier in the Gambino family. This guy, Dominic Pizzoni, Skinny Dom, who's now a captain in the Gambino family, and Tony Lee. And they had a dish with bagels on it and coffee, and they were eating bagels. And we walked in. You know, they all saw Frankie, they hugged him, they kissed him, hello, oh, we're glad to see you, this and that, blah, blah, blah. You want a bagel? And he said, no. And Tony says, all right, come in the back. I want to show you my garden. Because in the back of the club, Tony Lee had a big vegetable garden. He had a green thumb, Tony Lee. And and so we went back there, you know, he took it was like a scene in a movie, really. He took a paper bag and he walked out into the back and he was picking tomatoes and putting them in the paper bag and just talking to Frankie about, how, you know, just bullshitting to Frankie, not about anything important, just regular chit chat. And he put a couple of tomatoes in the paper bag and he goes, here, bring these home, you know, for you and Francine, who was my sister. And he handed Frankie the bag. As we walked out of the garden, we got back into the back of the club, and as we were walking, Tony Lee grabbed Frankie by the hand and said, I want to talk to you. And I just kept on walking. And Frankie stopped, and I walked out to the front. And when I walked out to the front, I looked at Dominic, and I gave Dominic the nod. And Dominic reached underneath the countertop, and he took out a revolver, and he put it behind his back, and he walked into the back. And then I just heard pop, 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 pop. I just heard a couple of shots. And then I looked and I saw Frankie laying on the floor and Dominic came out and he said, and he looked at me and he goes, this fucking guy don't want to die. And he put more bullets in the gun and he went back in. And then as I was looking, I saw Dominic just pop, pop, shot him a couple of more times. And then he came out and I worked my father had a big number office, like a lottery office. It was illegal, like a bookmaking type thing, but it was numbers. And I worked in the office during the day. And we walked out and Tony says to me, just to go to work, make out nothing happened, go to work, and then I'll come see you tonight. And I left. I went to do my regular routine, and they took his body and they put it in a sleeping bag, which I had bought the day before, and they put him in the trunk of Dominic's car. So I went to work that day, and then a couple hours later, my sister called me to tell me Frankie never came home. Where is he? I said, I don't know. I dropped him off on the corner. He made a phone call, and I don't know where the hell he is. So I had to go by our house, and I went by our house that night, and his parents were there, and I actually took his father to go. I mean, this is how insane the mob is, right? I actually took his father that night to go look for him, knowing that he was in the trunk of the car. So I took him, and then the next day, I wasn't on the boat, but Tony Lee, I knew that. The next day, they took him on this guy Tommy's boat, and they took him out into the Atlantic Ocean, and they wrapped him up, and Tony Lee punctured his lungs and cut open his stomach because they didn't want him to float up to the top, and they threw him in the ocean, and he's never been found. He hasn't been found. I mean, they never found his body, and then that was in '88, and then in '05, I got indicted for the murder.
All right, Anthony, we've got a few questions on this story then, because it is one of the most fascinating stories that's ever been told on this channel. I'm interested in getting a bit more detail. So when you're leading him to his death, how fine-tuned do you have to be into his senses? And, how fine-tuned do you have to be to detect any slight little change in his attitude to what's going on?
Well, first of all, when I got in the car, I made sure he had no weapons on him, and he didn't. And how I knew that is because of the way he was dressed. He had just a little white T-shirt on with shorts on, shoes, no socks. So I knew he had no weapons on him. So that right away was good. Yeah, I had to be fine-tuned because I had to bring him there no matter what. I couldn't say, even if I picked up on something, I would have had to get him there and then had to some way let them know that something's up. But as long as I stood calm and I just act naturally, everything would go smooth. And I could tell by his expression, he underestimated me. That's what it was. And I knew that. I knew he underestimated. I knew he felt that I wasn't maybe. And then I'm not saying this, I'm not proud of it. I'm just saying, I think he didn't think I was capable of that because he thought he was a tough guy and everything. So I think he sort of underestimated me. So it made my job a little easier, if that makes sense. And so I know as long as I stood calm and just carried on a normal conversation with him, I had him. And that's what happened. And I had him and I brought him there and I walked him in.
Bruno?
Yeah, that was a very good question, Shaun. I have a second part to that. So he had to know what he did, prior. So by him being hypersensitive and you kind of giving him the laid back attitude, going on the boat, doing whatever you're doing, that had to make him feel a little more calm. But in your opinion, Anthony, he had to know what was going on at some point. And, did he didn't give any type of, inclination that, he knew he was in some kind of trouble for what he did?
Well, I don't think this is, what happened was my mother never told my father. My mother was scared of him. This is what happened. So there was more to the story than him just beating up my mother. Prior to him actually laying hands on my mother, he was shaking her down for money. He was taking her to the bank. There was other incidents that happened. And she was in fear of him. And she was in fear of him hurting us, me or my brother. So like after the incident happened and I found out, my mother, I could see she was a nervous wreck. And at one point I told my mother, Ma, what's wrong with just Frankie? And she went, stay away from him. He's crazy. He'll hurt you. Just forget it. So she was in fear. So she never told my father. I think he just felt that we didn't say anything to anybody. I think he thought we were scared of him. He knew he didn't think my father knew, because when he first started dating my sister, his partner, Peter Sakara, told him, listen, this is Fat Andy's daughter. You better think about twice dating this girl. But that's what he did. He also dated before my sister, Sonny Francise's daughter. He dated Michael's sister before this incident. And he dated Danny Marino's niece before this incident. So his pattern was to date wise guys' daughters or relatives, because I guess he felt that was a shield for him. So I think he underestimated me. I think he never realized my father knew because of the fear my mother lived in. Because I'm telling you, he showed no inkling of where I was taking him. He was laughing. The way he was dressed, he had no weapons on him, and he walked in there with a smile on his face. So I think he just underestimated the whole situation and really believed that he had my mother wrapped up. And he knew Alice told me, but I don't think he thought I would take it any further.
So Anthony, the more I hear the story, the more I'm convinced it's that classic scene out of Godfather, the abusive brother-in-law. What makes these people think they could get away with beating up women and being abusive to the mom of someone who was so prestigious in the mafia as your father? What is going through these guys' minds to think they can get away with that disrespect?
He had a drug issue. I think alcohol played a part in that evening. You know what I mean? I think he had a few drinks in him that night, but he just thought he was invincible. Listen, he knew the deal. So, the reason why he died was he knew the deal. He knew that he was married to Fat Andy's daughter. He knew she was my sister. and he knew what my father was capable of doing, even though, but maybe he felt my father was in jail and he couldn't put it together. You know, I don't know what he thought, but he just thought he was invincible. And, you know, to move, just not to change the subject, but so he knew the deal. Like a couple of years later, my sister started dating another kid named Chris from the neighborhood. He was just a regular kid. He wasn't mobbed up. He didn't know nothing about the mob. He was just a kid. He liked to use drugs. He was hooked up with my sister, and they got arrested with a stolen car and some credit cards. They had gotten arrested. So I got my sister out on bail and everything, and I went to see my father. And I told my father what happened. You know, he knew my sister got arrested and everything. And he told me, he got your sister arrested. Does he know that she's my daughter? I said, Dad, this guy don't know nothing about wise guys. He's a kid from the neighborhood. He goes, yeah. He goes, well, you know what you got to do here, right? So I looked at him, I go, do you know what I got to do? I said, you want me to clip this kid? He goes, yeah, you know what you got to do here. I said, I'm not going to do that. I said, I said, what do you, I told my father, yeah, you know what we'll do, Dad? This is when he really got mad. I said, you know what we'll do, Dad? We'll kill everybody she goes out with till she meets a brain surgeon, and then, you know, and then we'll have a big wedding. I told him. So now he gets mad. Now he got, you know, he got mad. He goes, I'll take care of it myself. Forget it. Don't forget it. I'll take care of it on my own. Don't do nothing for me. I'll take care of it. I said, all right, then you take care of it. So I got back to the neighborhood and I sent for this kid. I said, listen, you better run away or do something because you're going to go. I said, you know, and he just, like, you could see the panic in the kid's face. And I never saw the kid again after that. A couple of years later, I got a letter from a guy that was in prison in upstate New York. And he said, listen, there's a kid here named Chris that said he used to date your sister. Do you know him? So then I knew the kid was still alive. I said, yeah, he's a kid. And the reason why I gave that kid a pass, and the reason why I helped save that kid was because he didn't know the deal. Frankie knew the deal. This kid didn't know. This kid was just a neighbor. If this kid would have knew the deal, then he would have got killed. So, because my belief system is, listen, if you want to be in the mob or you want to be associated with the mob, you know, if you do X, Y, and Z, A, B, C might happen to you. You know what I mean? So, you know, you gotta, you know, you have to follow the rules. And the rules are, you know, you don't beat up wise guys' wives or mothers. But he just thought he was invincible, and he underestimated me, and he walked in there like he walked right in without any kind of issue.
Wow. Over to you, Bruno.
Okay, you know, growing up in Brooklyn and, you know, growing up around everybody, you know, there's a couple of rules you don't break, Anthony. You know, you try to avoid dating any wise guy's daughter. You know what I mean? Or anybody, even talking to somebody's wife is, you know, it's frowned upon.
I know, yeah.
So, you know, how, you know, it's almost like the girls, they go after these guys knowing that the fathers are going to be mad. You know what I mean? And that's how everybody, so explain to us how everybody gets, you know, everything's connected. I'm not talking about, you know, just in the mob. I'm talking about, like, you know, you're hanging out with 5 different dudes and your sister or your buddy's sister, you know, you want to go out with her, this and that. Tell everybody about the unwritten rules about going out with somebody's ex-girlfriend. Is that how the dynamic works?
Listen, like, all right, so in the 70s, I used to run around with Neil's son, Buddy, Croach. Neil was the underboss of the Gambino family. I was very, very tight with his brother. Now, Neil had a daughter named Tony, very attractive girl, was crazy about me, used to want to be, you know, and I, you know, like, we would be out in a club, right? We would be out in a club and we would be all out partying, and then it'd be the end of the night, and she would ask me, would you drive me home? Now, I never drove her home without another person with me. So I would say, all right, Louie, take a ride. She goes, no, you just drive me home. And I went, what are you, fucking crazy? I'm not driving you home alone. Your father, you know, because now Tony, 2 people got killed over her.
I remember that.
Yeah. One guy, they rolled him up in a rug and burnt him in a lot. Another guy, Louis Baja, we had the contract to kill him. He was a coke dealer that hung out with us. he was going out with her. Neil gave my father, we set him up to get killed over her. So, so what the protocol is, you don't do that, but you know what? I mean, it happens. Like if someone comes to you and says, listen, I really like your daughter, your sister, if I take her out on a date, if you're okay with it, you're okay with it. But if you're not, and you tell them no, it's no. The thing is, but a lot of guys in the mob think even though the girlfriend's the ex-girlfriend, they're still the girlfriend. Like I know guys that wanted to kill people. Like I know there was a couple of guys in the Lucchese family that were going out with one of my friend's ex-girlfriends. They wanted to kill each other because they didn't think they should go out with them. Ronnie One Arm, I'm sure they hear that name, Ronnie One Arm. He was a captain in the Gambino family. He went out with this girl, Donna, and when he broke up with her, another guy, Robert, started dating her, and he wanted to kill the guy because he was going out with his ex-girlfriend. It's like they mark their territory. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, it's not, it's something you don't want to do, but it does happen. And sometimes it's good and sometimes it's not. I mean, my sister, a friend of mine dated my sister, Frankie. He was my partner, but I knew him, we all grew up together and I knew it was a respectful thing. And I was glad she was with him instead of the other bums that she used to date, so I guess it's an individual preference. You said that you were commissioned to set up the guy to be killed, the boyfriend. Did that happen? And if so, how did it happen? This is what happened. So we were hanging out with this guy named Louis Baja. He was a Puerto Rican kid. He was a big coke dealer, and he was a friend of ours, and he was hanging out with us. And like I said, Tony, Neil's daughter, and her brother Buddy were very close with me. And we used to all go out together. All of us, we used to go to discos together. And he started dating Tony. And Neil found out. But he was doing it on the sneak because I told him to stay away from her. He was told to stay away from Tony. Basically, we all told him to stay the fuck away from her. It's Neil's daughter, stay away from her. And he didn't listen, so he did it on the down low. So Neil sent for my father, and he knew that we were friends with Baja, that we could do it. And he told my father what was going on, and my father goes, "Okay, we'll take care, we'll take care of it." So we were setting up Louis Baja to be murdered. And what happened was we owned a bar. My brother and I owned a bar in Ozone Park called Mar Benny's. And one night he was in there, Louis, about 2 weeks before we were actually going to do it. And he was in there, and two of my friends that knew what we were going to do to Louis Baja were in there with Louis, and they thought they could impress my father. So it was raining out. So they took Louis Baja out of the bar and they shot him in the head, but he didn't die. He was crippled, he became an invalid, and he went back to Puerto Rico and he passed away a couple of years later. And my father wasn't happy with them, don't get me wrong, because the way they did it and the fact that he didn't even die. So, they thought they were going to impress my father by doing it because they knew what the situation was. And so Louis Baja got shot, but he didn't die. He was maimed, and unfortunately he passed away a couple of years later in Puerto Rico. But we were gonna do that. Her other boyfriend, her other coke dealing boyfriend, her brother killed him. Buddy killed him. They threw his body in a lot. So, you don't really want to go out with these guys' daughters, you know what I mean? It's not, there's other women around that you could go with. But like I said, in my brother-in-law's case, he thought it was like a shield because that was his thing. He went out with wise guys' daughters or nieces. He thought that was a good thing or a shield for him, that it was going to save him. But in the end, it got him killed.
Over to you, Bruno.
Okay. So, Anthony, I want to ask you, switching gears a little bit, you mentioned that you were away for a little bit of a coke problem or you had a drug problem. Yeah. Back in the 70s and 80s, I think everybody was doing coke. I was one of them as well. How did your crew perceive you after you went away to get a little help? was that considered you being a little, tainted, or, I don't know if I'm wording it correctly, but did anybody frown upon that? Can you give us a little insight on that about what you're going through with that?
I mean, my crew, everybody was happy for me. Listen, when I got out of treatment, I got out of treatment on I spoke about this numerous times. When I got out of treatment, on a Wednesday night. I flew back home on a Wednesday night. Saturday, I knew John Gotti, who was the boss now, ate lunch every Saturday afternoon at the Bergen Fish Club. He held court there every Saturday afternoon. So I got out of treatment. I wanted to go say hello to him, of course. He knew I was in treatment. I went there with Tony Lee, my father's partner. We went to the Bergen Fish Club. We went in, he sees me, he hugs me, kisses me, right? We have lunch. After lunch, he says, come outside, I want to talk to you. Now this is John Gotti, he's the boss. We go outside and he looks at me, he goes, how do you feel? I said, I feel good. He goes, do you think you got it beat? Right, just like that. So I look at him, so I go, well, I'm not going to do any of it today. I told him, just for today, right? I said, well, I'm not going to do any of it today. He goes, okay. He says to me, what can I do for you? I don't want, what do you need? You need anything? I don't want you stressed out. Now, this is the boss of the most powerful crime family in the country at the time. He's asking me what he could do for me because he doesn't want me stressed out, right? So I says, well, I don't have a car. I didn't have a car at the time because I don't know, my car got wrecked. And, I said, I don't have a car. He goes, you don't have a car? I said, no, not yet. I got to go get one. He goes, all right. He goes, we go back in. He goes in. So next to the Bergen Fish Club, he had an office. And he goes in his office and he makes a phone call. He comes out and he goes, okay, listen, go to 84th Street and Atlantic Avenue, and there's a car lot. He goes, go in there and ask for a guy named Anthony. Which he says, and he'll know, he's waiting for you. I said, all right. So Tony Lee takes me to this car lot on Atlantic Avenue. I walk in and I go to the guy, you Anthony? He goes, yeah. I said, John sent me. He goes, John sent me. He goes, look around, let me know which car you want, take whatever car you want. He told me, right? So now I'm in this car lot. I'm looking, of course, I'm looking for a Cadillac now, right? I'm looking around, right? And I'm looking around and I see this beautiful, back in the day, this is 1988, right? I see this beautiful white four-door Pontiac Bonneville, beautiful car, white saddle leather interior, right? So I tell the guy, how about that car? He goes, you like it? I go, yeah. Boom, puts the plates on it, whatever. I drive off the lot. I go back to the Bergen Fish Club. I show John the Bonneville, right? He says, all right. He goes in his pocket and he takes out $2,000. And he says to me, here's $2,000. He says, I want you to come here every Saturday with $100. And he went, and don't fucking disappoint me, with his finger. Because if you ever see his films, he's always pointing with his finger. You ever see the films of him, like, the surveillance pictures? He used to talk like this and he used to point with his finger. And he says, and don't disappoint me. I said, no, I'll be here every Saturday. So I went back the next Saturday. I gave him 100. I went back the second Saturday. I gave him 100. The third Saturday, I go back. And we go for a walk and he tells me, how you doing? I go, I'm doing good. I go, I'm doing good. I'm back to work. I feel great. I was looking better. I put on weight. I was dressed nice. I was starting to feel like my old self again. You know what I mean? And you could see it. He says, well, you look good. I go, thanks. He says, how much more you owe me? I said, well, would this make $1,700? He goes, okay, keep it, the rest for a gift. Nice. So, here's the boss of a family, and treating me like I'm his son, so what it was I think a lot of people were happy because, before that, I knew that life. I was good at it, and I was good at it, and and I was good at it, and everybody knew I was good at it, and I was Fat Andy's son. So I think a lot of people were glad because it benefited them too. Not only me, it benefited them too. Like it benefited Nicky Carrazzo, who was a captain, who I got later on got indicted with a few years down the line. We got indicted on a big case in Miami. So a lot of people were rooting for me because they knew that I was capable of certain things that would benefit everybody at large. So yeah, don't get me wrong. Some people, bad rapped me and all that shit, junkie and this and that. But overall, I think the people that really cared about me were happy for me and were rooting for me.
All right, we're going to go back to the beginning now, Anthony, and just take your story through the order of things happening. And let's start with your family history, Murder Inc., your dad, how he started out, doing his scams, and then he got incorporated and all that stuff. Yeah.
So my father was born in 1926. In 1932, his father passed away. My grandfather, he got hit by a trolley car in Brooklyn, and he died in the street. He bled out in the street. So now my father was 8 years old when his father died. At that point in time, my father's friends, my father lived in East New York, which was a very mobbed up neighborhood. At that point in time, my father's two best friends were this guy, Larry Abendando and Lenny Dodona. Larry Abendando's father was the Dasher. He was a member of Murders Incorporated. He got, if you Google his name, the Dasher, it all comes up. He got the chair with Lepke and all them guys. He was one of the main killers. And Lenny Dodone's uncle was Happy Mayoni. He was another member of Murders Incorporated who Abe Rellis gave up for the murders, and they all got the electric chair with Lepke. So his two best friends had relatives in Murders Incorporated. So my father was raised by these people. So he was in and out of their houses. Later on, he hooked up with Tony Lee, who later became his lifelong partner. So he was always around mob guys, and he had no father. So they were the sort of the people that he looked up to. And he was a tough kid, from what he tells me, he was a tough kid. He said he learned how to fight because in Brooklyn, everybody were Brooklyn Dodger fans. I know you like soccer over there, but we like baseball over here. So my father was a Yankee fan. My father loved Joe DiMaggio. So he told me he learned how to fight really good because he used to have to knock out all the Brooklyn Dodger fans because he was the only Yankee fan in the neighborhood. He said so. That's how he learned how to fight good. So anyway, he was a tough kid. He got drafted during the war when he was 18. And, he had no father. He had, his mother owned the candy store, my grandmother. And he went into the service at 18. He got drafted, and he was in basic training down south. And he had a very abusive sergeant, a Southern guy who kept calling him racial names, Guinea, Wop, and, abusing him and everything. So my father stabbed him. He waited for him one night to go into the latrine, and he followed him in the latrine, and he stabbed him up, and he hitchhiked back to Brooklyn. And he came back to Brooklyn, and my grandmother made him surrender, and he surrendered to the MPs, and he went to prison. He went to Leavenworth for a couple of years. The war ended. He got out of Leavenworth, and he was only home 6 months. He went back to prison. He got arrested in Brooklyn. He went back to prison, and in prison in Sing Sing, he hung out with a lot of wise guys in there. This guy, Chrissy Ticker, took him under his wing, who later became the underboss of the Lucchese family, took him under his wing and, started schooling him. But when he got out of Sing Sing, he hooked it back up with Tony Lee, and they had no money. And they started robbing poker games in Brooklyn, poker games, small dice games. And they robbed 2 poker games. They robbed this guy, Tony the Sheik's poker game. He was, at the time, a soldier in the Genovese family. He later became a captain. And they robbed this guy, Charlie Wagon's poker game, who was a wise guy with Albert Anastasia, with the Mangano family at the time. So what happened was after they robbed Charlie's poker game, he sent for Albert Mayoni, who was Happy Mayoni's brother, the member of Murders Incorporated that I told you about earlier. And he asked Albert, who is this kid Andy that's robbing these poker games and everything? Who is this kid? He says, he's from the neighborhood. So Albert said, yeah. He said, he's Liberty's kid brother. Now, Liberty was my older uncle, Frank, who was my father's oldest brother, who everybody in the neighborhood knew. So he said, that's Liberty's kid brother. He goes, that's Liberty's kid brother. He says, you think you could get the money back from him? So Albert told him, listen, there's only 2 things you could do with this kid. Either you could kill him or give him a job. He's not giving you back the money. There's no way he's going to give you back the money. So Charlie says, could you bring him here to meet me? So Albert said, I'll try. So Albert told my father that Charlie wanted to see him. So my father went there with Tony Lee. Tony Lee stood outside with guns. He said Tony was in a car outside with 2 pistols. And my father went in by himself and had a conversation with Charlie. And Charlie took a liking to him. and made my father instantly became Charlie's driver. So my father started driving Charlie around. Now, my father at the time was a kid. He was only 23 or 24 years old. He was a baby. And he said one day he was in the bar with Charlie, and Charlie took him outside to come outside. I want to talk to you. And he took my father outside, and Charlie asked my father, he said, listen, if I ask you to kill somebody, would you do it without asking any questions? So I told my father, yeah. He goes, so I said, what did you do? He goes, well, I looked at him. He goes, and I said, yeah. I said, yeah, if it's, I definitely, I said, yeah, I wanted to get straightened out. He goes, I knew the deal by then. And I told him, yeah. I said, and then he said about a couple of weeks later, they picked him up at his mother, because he still lived home with his mother. He wasn't even married yet. He still lived home with his mother. So they picked him up at my grandmother's house with Charlie and another guy in the front seat. And there was another car following them with Charlie's brother, Danny, was driving it. And my father got in the back seat and they pulled out. And my father told me when we pulled out and got away from grandma's house, he goes, I whispered in the guy's ear. I said, you whispered in the guy. I didn't know what he was talking about. I said, you whispered in the guy's ear. What do you mean you whispered in the guy's ear? And he went like this with his hand. He goes, I whispered in his ear. And I said, oh. And that was the first hit he did for that family. And then after that, Charlie introduced him to Albert Anastasia. And then he did a couple of more murders for Albert. And then the books were closed at the time, but he was a special case. This is a picture. You can see this. This is a picture when he was 26 years old. My mother's pregnant in this picture with me. This is when he just first got straightened out. This is a portrait that John Gotti had made for me of my parents. John had that made for me about 40 years ago. Yeah. So anyway, they took him to see Albert Anastasia, and Albert used to call him the kid. He said Albert used to call me the kid. I used to go meet him. He used to give me a pair of gloves and a gun and say, go down there and kill that guy. And that was it. Albert was the high executioner. So because he did so much work for them, he got straightened out when the books were closed. And when his name went around, so now when you get proposed, they put your name on a piece of paper and they pass it around to all the families, the 5 families, and everybody has to approve it to see if anybody wants to put in any beefs or claims that you shouldn't, you don't deserve to get straightened out. And what happened was this guy, Tony the Sheik, actually put in a beef that he didn't want my father straightened out. So they had to sit down in Manhattan with Tony the Sheik, a captain from the Genovese family, and Albert Anastasia, and Charlie, and this guy, Tommy Raven, who was the captain. And my father had to sit at another table because he wasn't straightened out yet. So he sat, but he could hear everything. And Tony the Sheik told Albert Anastasia that my father was an animal. He said, this kid's an animal. He shouldn't get straightened out. He's an animal. He has no respect, and on and on and on and on. And my father said Albert Anastasia was just like staring at him. And then Albert Anastasia told Tony the Sheik he's an animal. So Tony the Sheik goes, yeah. He spoke broken English, Tony the Sheik, because he was from Italy. He goes, yeah, he's an animal. So Albert Anastasia said he's an animal. He goes, well, who the fuck you want me to straighten out? Priests? So like that was the end of the conversation. You know what I mean? Like, and that was it. So and of course my father got straightened out in 1953, the same year I was born. The books were closed. Him and another guy, Frankie Martin, got straightened out. There were special cases, and that was the beginning of